Hey guys, we're back to the blue playthrough during history. Sorry it's taken me so long to make another one. I just had a crazy last few weeks. I went to Orlando to see my boyfriend for my birthday, and then he came up here, and there's been a major change in my life. I think I'll make a video later after I talk to him if he wants me to announce it. And school's also started back on the 18th for us, so first few days of teaching, trying to get everything done, but it's been really good so far. I'm excited. I love all my 8th graders. Go Mustangs. And I also want to show a card I pulled yesterday because apparently the Polka Gods were apologizing for dropping a trailer for Sun and Moon in the middle of class because all the kids were watching it. There you go. Secret Rare Volcanion EX from Steam Siege. So, Pokemon Blue playthrough. So today's topic is the civil rights. I know I had somebody ask me to do World War II, but since I've already made a video talking about Winston Churchill and World War II, I thought I'd talk about the civil rights movement. There's several civil rights, so I'm assuming the one they wanted me to talk about was the one in the U.S. where we had Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Now, the civil rights movement starts in 1954 and goes through 1968, and there's several different parts of the civil rights movement. You have the medical movement where you have doctors coming down from the north. I'm trying to remember what the acronym is, but they'd come down to the south to treat those who were trying to block African Americans from going in clinics, because it used to be African Americans had separate clinics and separate wings of the hospital, and they were trying to make medical equality. I think it's MCHR. And they worked pretty close with Martin Luther King Jr. They actually were on the Selma March with him. And of course, you have the civil rights activists like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. Now I'm blanking on her name. There was a female one that I'm not thinking of. And then you also have the extremist movements, like some of the Black Panther members who started bombing places. But they all were fighting for the same thing, which was equality of African Americans. But we can even trace it back earlier than 1945 to the Freedmen's Bureau, which was formed right after the Civil War. Hold on, I'm looking up the date. Because I don't remember. I know it's founded under not Jackson, the guy after Lincoln. But he wasn't very happy with it. Johnson. Sorry, I'm looking it up and it's not quite working out. But the Freedmen's Bureau was founded after the Civil War, and it was created to try and help the newly freed African Americans find jobs and be able to function on their own, because they actually couldn't sign their own contracts. They weren't allowed to learn to read and write slaves, so many of them had no education, so they had no clue what they were signing on half the time. So what ended up happening was they ended up getting in a lot of bad situations because the people who owned the land were the plantation owners, and the poor white farmers really didn't appreciate them, so they started chasing them off. But some of the major cases that came out of the civil rights, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, which forces school integration. But she's not the first case. Ruby actually is, and I don't remember what the actual case called for hers is. But Ruby's case is a little bit earlier than Brown versus Board of Topeka, Kansas. We also have the civil rights, not civil rights, Love versus New York, Love versus Virginia, which was 1967, where it legalized interracial marriage, which was absolutely huge. And I think they're making a movie on that too, where this couple, they were living in Virginia, and it was illegal for blacks and whites to be married, so they ended up having to sue to be able to get married. I mean, it sounds ridiculous today, but back then that was normal. I'm trying to figure out. I apparently have to fight somebody to get the money to catch Pokemon. Oh, I have Pokemon. Never mind. But you also have the 23rd and 24th Amendment. The 23rd Amendment of the Constitution was passed in 1961. And this establishes, I believe this is the one. Oh, this is direct election. And the 24th Amendment is the making poll taxes and tests illegal, so literacy tests. Back then, you had to pay a tax to actually vote. So you had to know every single state judge, senator. You had to know a lot of history of the states, which I didn't teach in the black schools. So it was created to stop the blacks from voting. You also have several civil rights acts that are passed, but the most important one is going to be passed by LBJ. And yeah, he does kind of bully his way through it. Now, the goal of the civil rights was to make African Americans equal, because even though they'd been freed after the Civil War, they were not equal in society. A lot of times they were treated much harsher, and they were accused of crimes that they didn't commit, and they were living in a Jim Crow society. Now, Jim and Jane Crow is the term used for the society of the time where African Americans are being oppressed by the whites who lived there. And African Americans weren't the only group. You also had people who were of the Jewish faith, people who were immigrants. And actually, back then, it used to be we were more racist against African Americans and Asians than we were Mexicans coming into nations. We wanted Mexicans to come in. It was particularly led in the South. One of the first leaders is a man by the name of Walter Reuther, R-E-U-T-H-E-R, who was a labor leader who was actually white. And you have all these different ways of protest. You have the Alabama or Montgomery bus boycotts, and then you have the sit-ins at the counters. The bus boycott was from 1955 to 1956. The most famous sit-in was in Greensboro in 1960 in North Carolina. You also had church sermons, and you had the Black Power movement. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. is probably one of the most important figures. By the way, did you guys know that Professor Xavier from X-Men is actually based off Martin Luther King Jr.? He is based off him because, like Xavier, he wants to take a peaceful method, while Magneto, who is based off Malcolm X, wants to take an extreme approach. So, Martin Luther King Jr. will actually win a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the Civil Rights Movement in 1964. Now, the background of it, of course, we can trace back to the American Civil War, but we can even trace it back further to the American Naturalization Act of 1790, which says that all citizens who are white, keyword there, who are white, born in the U.S., are citizens of the U.S. Now, during the Civil War, of course, we passed the 13th Amendment, which ends all forms of slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which is kind of important. Most people forget to talk about this. The 14th Amendment, passed in 1868, gave African Americans citizenship, meaning that they're now citizens of the United States. Fast forward until 1870, you have the 15th Amendment, which says African American males have the right to vote. Again, only males could vote at this time. And there's a lot of turbulence because this is a reconstruction, and you have the rise of the first Ku Klux Klan. Do not confuse the first Ku Klux Klan with the modern Klan. They're two different clans. The original Ku Klux Klan was to defend, and then they kind of fell apart because they did attack African Americans, but not as severely. They were more targeting immigrants, but the first Klan ended up falling apart because its leader became an alcoholic, and yeah, he kind of led the group down a very bad path. And you have the Republicans, who were mainly defending the blacks during this time. You have Ulysses S. Grant, who was one of the generals of during the Civil War come in. He is a president, and he tries to defend the blacks, and he tries to create a nation united, even if it's divided by the ideas of the Old South. And you have a great deal of uprising. I mean, Woodrow Wilson ends up taking the United States back because he removes a lot of African Americans from federal posts because he's born in the South. He's born kind of racist. So you have that fact. And then you have Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington is an African American man who, he's done several things. Let's kind of talk about Washington. He is buried at the Tuskegee University in Tuskegee, Alabama. He died at November 14th, 1915 at age 59. Now, he was a leader of the African American community between 1890 and 1915 at his death, and he's the one who starts fighting the Jim Crow in the South. He doesn't want to move out of the South. He helps found the Tuskegee Institute, and also sets up the NAACP. Now, he's invited in 1901 to the White House by Theodore Roosevelt. Now, why am I talking about this? Because this was a huge, huge issue. So, people didn't like that. They didn't want the president to have an African American sit with them at dinner, and he was advised not to do it. And Roosevelt said, "No, I'm going to do it." So during this time, you also have racial segregation. You have the lynchings. You have the Ku Klux Klan that's doing everything crazy, and they're trying to kill people. They're trying to scare the blacks into submitting to the whites. Now, you will have this major case in 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson. Plessy was actually a man who was half white, half black, but you really couldn't tell. And in Louisiana, they had passed this law that said that there was a black-only car, and car for a train, even if you're only a little bit black, you still had a ride in it. Well, Plessy went to challenge it. Ferguson, who was a cop who knew Plessy, arrested him on the spot. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court came up with this concept, separate but equal, meaning, yeah, we will provide you with schools, we'll provide you with ways of transportation, we'll provide you with bathrooms that are separate from the whites, but they should be equal. Is that always the case? No. Definitely not. Now, Plessy v. Ferguson will hold up till Brown versus Board of Education, where they'll strike down separate but equal. Now, racial segregation is mostly done by laws in the government saying, okay, you can go here, but you can't go here. African Americans, you have your own bathrooms, you have your own places. If you're on a bus, you're supposed to sit at the back of the bus. You're not supposed to sit at the front. If a white person tells you to move, you're supposed to move. And it was also kind of known as the color doctrine. Now, we also had the disenfranchisement of all African Americans, even the ones who actually graduated from college and had successful careers, like Madam Chase Walker, who is the first female African American multimillionaire. She made hair products for African American women, and she was absolutely fascinating. If you guys want a really good history fair project, I really highly suggest doing her. I'm trying to talk a few students into doing her, actually, but she's absolutely interesting to read about and to talk about. And you also have housing segregation. So in the South especially, there was neighborhoods that were for white people only, and there was neighborhoods for black people only. And this separation was huge. Now, some key events, of course, Brown versus Board of Education, which happens in 1954. This is where the Brown family sues the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, saying that they want their daughter to go to a school that was closer to their house because the school they were sending her to was like 45 minutes away. And it was just because she was African American. And they end up winning this case. The Supreme Court strikes down separate but equal. You have Rosa Parks, who refused to get moved for the bus in 1955, December 1st, 1955, And then the Montgomery bus boycotts, which was absolutely incredible. White person told Rosa Parks to move. She said, no, I'm not going to move. This is my seat. I got here first. And they ended up beating her, arresting her, and it was absolutely atrocious. But then you have the Montgomery bus boycotts to try and put it into... try and raise attention for this. You have the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School in 1957, which they actually had to send in National Guards. Lyndon Johnson had to order National Guards in to let 9 African American students enter the high school on September 4th, 1957. On the first day, it was absolutely crazy. In the end, they did end up shutting down the high school. And you also have the nonviolence movement led by Martin Luther King. And what else do I want to talk about? You have the sit-ins by the NAACP, the freedom rides. Okay. If any of you guys have ever seen or heard of the movie Mississippi Burning, this is what this is about. The freedom rides are northern people who come down and they ride through the South, and they're trying to help, like, voter drives and trying to get African Americans some freedoms. And what ended up happening in Mississippi in particular, there was, I think it was 2 white students, 1 African American student, who were actually chased down and killed by the Ku Klux Klan. I think the case finally went to trial a few years back and they convicted somebody for it. And their bodies were found like 2 weeks later. It was a huge investigation. Another major thing is in Mississippi, the integration of Mississippi University from 1956 to 1965, which is absolutely massive. Like, Mississippi was one of those states where there wasn't as many issues, but there was enough to where it still gets talked about. It's not like, well, Mississippi, yeah, you have Mississippi burning, and you also have all the issues in Mississippi, but Alabama's focused on much more, but Mississippi was probably one of the harder states for the civil rights movement, and that's just because of who the governor was at the time. Let's see, is there anything else? I think I'm going to save the rest for later. I'm going to save here. So next time I'm going to do a part 2 on the civil rights movement. I'm going to talk about the medical movement, and I will also talk about the people in the civil rights movement, and then I will do one on World War II. I'm probably going to do 3 on World War II because we have the movie Dunkirk coming out. Well, have a wonderful day. Bye, guys.